First thing I'd like to say on this talk, which will be a continuation basically of our ultimate basis of creation science from Genesis 1. This will be part 5. We'll be dealing with day 4, which deals with the creation of heavenly bodies. What I wanted to say is that every one of you today were influenced by what God did on day 4. You probably don't even think about it, because every day we are influenced on what God did on that day. How many of you have a watch? Your watch is dependent on what God did on day 4. If you ate a meal and you regularly eat a meal at a certain time, well, that was scheduled according to what God did on day 4. Your month, the whole cycle of the month is based on what God did on day 4. So all activities, everything that we do day in and day out is somewhat regulated by what God did on day 4. So this touches us very directly. So let's take a look at this, and let me give you a little bit of an introduction. I've been using this slide to kind of emphasize the importance of Genesis. John Davis, in his commentary, says, "No other piece of ancient Near Eastern literature that has survived the ravages of time compares favorably with the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is therefore of utmost value to the scientist, historian, and theologian." So if you're a scientist, this should interest you. If you're a historian, this should interest you. If you're a theologian, this should interest you. If you're just an everyday person, this should interest you, because we have the origin and beginnings of virtually everything in the book of Genesis. And certainly the origin and basis for astronomy, which we will focus in on today. So I'm going to kind of follow up on what Jim did in the last talk. He dealt with astronomy. This is going to kind of add on. I may use a few of the same scriptures that he used, and a few others, and from a different slant. First of all, let me introduce this. I said in the very beginning, in the introduction to this whole series, Book of Genesis was written to prepare the nation of Israel, which was not even a nation yet, but the formation of these people into a nation. It was written to prepare them and to give them a different worldview, if you will, a different perspective on all things, basically. They were coming out of Egypt. And out of Egypt, they were raised and they grew up. Perhaps some of them, even if they were influenced by the Egyptian culture, they were influenced by the religion of Egypt, which one of the major gods was the sun god. And that's pretty prominent in Egyptian culture. So the sun god Re or Atun, depending on what age, that was the sun god that was worshipped in Egypt. So they were acquainted with heavenly bodies and the worship of them. The moon was prominent as the eye of another major god named Horus. They were going to go eventually into Canaan. This is where they were going to live. So they were going to be amongst a Canaanite people that also worshipped heavenly bodies. There's actually a city that's named after the sun. Shemesh is Hebrew for sun. Beth or Beit, what is that? Some of you have taken a little bit of Hebrew. House or temple of the sun, basically. So this city, Beth Shemesh, which is about 15 miles west of Jerusalem, not a major city, but it reflects a little bit of the Canaanite culture and the fact that they worshipped the sun. The moon, Yari, was also worshipped amongst the Canaanites. The Jews would have contact with the Sumerian culture. They were also sun worshippers. Their god, Utu. The moon, Nana, was a god of the worship of the moon. So all of these influences the nation of Israel would have to encounter and counteract. So Moses writes the book of Genesis, not just solely for this purpose, but this is one of the emphases of at least day 4. The Babylonians, which the Jews would also have contact with, This is where astrology comes from. Part of astrology is an admiration, at least, if not a worship of the stars. That source is Babylon. So all of these cultures, these would be the neighbors, the near proximity of the children of Israel on different occasions. The book of Genesis writes to give a different perspective, a different worldview. And one thing that we will notice is that there is no rival God in Genesis chapter 1 that rivals Elohim, or the God of the nation of Israel. And everything else, including these magnificent heavenly bodies that were worshipped by all these cultures, were created by Yahweh. They find their origin, their material. They're not deities. They don't have personality. They're matter. They're creations of the one true God. So the book is written from that perspective. We've been looking at these creation days very quickly. The first three seem to focus on God adding form or organizing the formlessness that existed in verse 2. The earth was formless and void. Verse 1, the first thing that is introduced is light. Then we have the sky and water are dealt with in day 2. Last time we looked at the land, where God brings the land to the forefront, and then the first mention of life or plant life. Now in day 4, we have God filling all of these environments, you might say, so that they would no longer be empty. So He's correcting the formlessness and the void condition of verse 2 in the book of Genesis. By the way, if you haven't turned to Genesis 1, you might do that. Another thing you want to do is turn to 2 Peter chapter 3 and just keep a bookmark or your finger in that passage. I want to look at it because it's going to inform us concerning an issue that we'll get to in a moment. So on day 4, we're looking at lights that correct the emptiness within the universe. And these are the heavenly bodies. The next day that we'll look at is the fowl and the fish that fill the sky and the waters. And then animals and man will fill the land masses, and we'll get to that point. There's a lot more I could say on this, but for the sake of time, I've got a lot tonight, so hopefully we'll be able to get to all of it. Where are we time-wise? So I can kind of keep track of things here. Real quick summary. Day 1, some of the major emphases or some of the major thoughts that I tried to bring out, some of the major principles. Obviously, day 1, God creates light, so light is a major focus. We spent a lot of time talking about that. Another thing I mentioned in day 1 and even preceding day 1, a major difference between Christianity or biblical theology or Old Testament ideas is the distinction between the Creator and the creation. All the other religions mesh those two. Only the biblical worldview distinguishes and separates God. He is transcendent. He is separate. As I've already mentioned, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, they all worshipped the creation. There was no distinction. They made gods out of the creation. So this is a major distinction. You can look for that, and you'll see that in every case, even the present-day religions. Secondly, God is speaking things into existence. This is very important. We have the basis for language, communication, intelligence, and the communication of ideas and thought. That's also at the very beginning. Now we see this in every one of the days, but the very first day begins, and God said. God speaks. That's at the very beginning of the creative week. Day 2, we have the stretching out of space and perhaps even elements and molecules. It doesn't tell us, but if you want to look at it from that perspective, that's possible. Now, it's important to also note that we'll develop this a little further. In the stretching out of space, there are no stars. There are no heavenly bodies, at least from the young earth perspective. We'll talk a lot about that tonight. We also have a separation of the waters. Russ Humphrey's view is that there's waters at the outer edge of the universe, separated from the waters of the earth. In fact, at day one, all of the earth was nothing but water. At least that's the description. And then last time in day 3, we saw the creation of land masses and what we would call the origin of life. The origin of life did not begin in the oceans, as the evolutionist tells us. Life began by God's creative work and placed on the land masses. So that's a summary of where we've been. And this evening we'll look at day 4. By way of further introduction, if you plot kind of the creation days and the events and the things that are created up against the evolutionary scheme, one of the main things that you're going to see is massive inconsistencies. And I'm going to bring some of this out in some of the detail that we'll look at in a moment. So don't get too concerned about this slide. Just notice this is a listing of the major things that evolution says that came about over long periods of time, gradually moving from one stage or one phase of another. Whereas we have the creation week in 6 days that is totally out of sequence. And this is the main thing that we have in this passage, is a major inconsistency with evolutionary theory. As you might notice, they have light, then stars, this is the sequence, then galaxies, then planets, and amongst the planets, one of them would be Earth, and then oceans. That's totally different from the biblical picture. In fact, we have the waters of the deep initially, even in verse 2, even before day 1. And we don't have galaxies or stars forming into galaxies. In the passage, we're going to see that stars are almost an afterthought. Oh, by the way, He also created the stars. So it's totally out of sequence, which tells us one system is probably not right, and perhaps the other one is correct. And you know what we believe. We believe that obviously that God created in 6 days. So we'll look at this again. So light is pretty close to the beginning. The universe, evolution says the Big Bang, and we see no evidence of that in Genesis chapter 1. So we reject all of that. So the sequence is out of phase. There's no Big Bang and light before the stars, which is a major contradiction, a major problem for evolutionary theory. And hopefully I'll be able to explain from our perspective how we can explain that even from a scientific perspective.